Winter has arrived, with the new season of Game of Thrones starting to air on HBO and George R.R. Martin releasing the next book someday, so we thought it is a perfect moment to talk about Telltale's Game of Thrones episodic series and how it fails, in my opinion, to capture the franchise's core intensity. My name is Stanislav Kostyuk, and welcome to Farlands, a series about video games and video game design. Today, we're going to talk about why Telltale's Game of Thrones should not have a game over screen that allows you to retry a segment. And warning, there will be spoilers for Telltale's Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead series. But first, let's talk about what people call the Telltale formula. Telltale has been making episodic adventure games for quite some time, at first mostly being known for Sam & Max and Tales of Monkey Island, which are traditional point-and-click adventure games. But then, it hit a goldmine with the release of The Walking Dead, which had less puzzles, but more dialogue scene interactions and action scenes, ultimately making the game focused more on the characters and narrative. One of the key phrases that you're met with every episode is, the game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored by how you play. And from time to time, the game shows in the corner what has become somewhat a meme, that this character will remember that. It is important to note, however, that your choices usually affect dialogues and some particular scenes or subplots, but not the overall narrative structure. This nature of choices is also the biggest criticism against Telltale's games, that what you do doesn't affect the global narrative as much as you've seen plenty of RPGs, for example. And it's true that at least so far there are very few choices in Telltale's productions that have massive ramifications. But all the little choices do have ramifications over your personal experience with the characters surrounding you. What kind of Lee you are, what do you teach Clementine, how do you see other characters and how do they see you. And that helps personalize the experience a lot, which is why even though the choices are not as epic in scope as, let's say, The Witcher 2, where the whole middle section of the game is entirely different depending on one choice, The Walking Dead became so very successful. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey, the context. Both Carla and Doug will always die, one later than the other. But who do you save when you get the chance? Why? Your group will always take food from the car, but will you do it with them? Or will you support Clementine, who thinks it's wrong to steal without knowing if it belongs to anybody? Will you take the gun to shoot the infected child of your friend so he wouldn't have to do it himself? Or will you both just leave the dying boy in the wild? These are very potent questions that resonate with people, which is why Telltale in other games started reusing this whole approach that later became known as the Telltale formula. And it works fantastically in games like The Walking Dead and Tales from the Borderlands. Game of Thrones, though, not so much. One of the key specifics of the world's narrative tropes is that no character is really safe, including point-of-view characters. Some important personalities may die a very low-key and disappointing death without resolving their character arcs, and the world just goes on. It is how the books and the show manage to have so many consistently intense moments. In Telltale games, however, death is a punctuation that usually has narrative significance and pushes somebody's character arc, especially when it comes to point-of-view characters. They can't just die, and this is why we accept the game over screens that let us retry. This doesn't work for Game of Thrones, so one has to adapt the Telltale formula to fit that franchise. And the first episode does give that impression. At the end of it, one of our playable characters, Ethan, gets murdered in cold blood. This moment is unavoidable regardless of what you do, which is fine because it works really well for sending a message that this is, in fact, Game of Thrones, where you spend time making choices as a character, thinking how it'll affect the rest of the season and relationships with other people, and then just die. That was such a great and shocking moment. But a couple episodes in, I got really disappointed. There is a scene in the game where you, as current family lord Roderick Forrester, go to negotiate with your rivals, the Whitehills, over release of your brother. The conflict and tension between Forresters and Whitehills that can erupt into a war at any moment is core to the narrative, and my previous choices were really hindering these negotiations, which made the whole scenario even more suspenseful. and then I failed. Shit went down, many people died, including Roderick. I yelled no, as was regretting all the previous choices I have made and had to live with. And then it happened. The screen went red, said Valar Morghulis, and allowed me to restart the whole scene. This is when, for me, the whole spirit of Game of Thrones was lost. Granted, Roderick does have a very epic potential death scene planned out by Telltale in a later episode that fits his character arc. And while this scene was great and emotional, the thought that in my playthrough Roderick should have died earlier couldn't leave my mind. It's Game of Thrones. If a character dies, I shouldn't be made to just restart the segment to make him not die until the scriptwriters find a moment they feel to be most fitting for death. Now, obviously, deaths in the book and the show aren't just random and happen when the writer finds it most fitting, but that's not how readers and viewers experience it, and therefore not how gamers should experience it either. There are two ways Telltale could handle this in the game to keep the spirit of Game of Thrones. The first way is the simpler and less risky one. Just not allow point-of-view characters to die until the moment they can or have to die. However, the issue with that approach is that players will catch on to that and there will be no intensity at all in action sequences or dramatic moments unless you make it about other people dying, but that actually raises the amount of content needed to make significantly. There is a bolder but riskier approach that actually fits Telltale's Game of Thrones narrative perfectly and doesn't add a lot of extra work, to this season at least. And that is, just let point-of-view characters die and go on. Every point-of-view character essentially has got their own location they spend the most time in. Garrett spends a bit in Ironrath in the beginning, but after that he's beyond the wall, while Asher and Roderick meet up only at the end of episode 5, and one of them has to die anyway at that meeting. So from gameplay point of view in episode 6, it doesn't matter if, let's say, Asher died in episode 5 or back in episode 2. There are two disadvantages to this approach. The first one is that for some players, episodes may get shorter depending on how many people are alive. Or heck, the whole season can. Also, this is not exactly future-proof, although I do think that if one is to make Season 2, then you could just create a couple additional characters to replace the point-of-view ones if needed. Besides, everybody has got at least one companion who can take over the role. This would work in Season 1 as well, where let's say if Asher dies, Baksha can still arrive on his behalf to Ironrath at the end of episode 5. And then the Ironrath segment of episode 6 just uses the Asher is dead scenario. So there are risks. In return, however, we get a much greater replayability as people will try to find ways to keep everyone alive, and action moments or suspenseful moments will be so much more intense because you know there will be consequences. Death. After all, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. And that choice at the end of episode 5, where you need to decide who lives, Asher or Roderick, it is sadistic enough in the game's current implementation. Imagine how horrible, in a good way, players would feel if they had spent so much effort making sure neither of those characters die throughout the whole season. That would be so Game of Thrones. The thing about formulas is that there is no silver bullet. There is no general approach that fits everything. The Walking Dead and Tales from the Borderlands might take place in different universes, have different narrative tones, but the design approach to choices and consequences and narrative structure is very similar, and it works in both games. It fits there, but not in Game of Thrones. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave any comments below. Do you agree with the sentiment expressed in the video, or do you think that Game of Thrones game is good as it is? And if you'd like, consider supporting my work on Patreon. A special thank you goes to Paolo Di Stefano. Your support is very appreciated. Thank you very much.